Are the Gospels historically reliable accounts of Jesus' life, or are they the result of decades of oral storytelling, theological editing, and myth-making? If these books were truly written by eyewitnesses, why do they contradict each other? And why do scholars overwhelmingly agree that they were written long after the events they describe? In this second video of our New Testament for Skeptics series, we take a critical look at the first 4 books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. By the end, you'll see just how much of what we think we know about Jesus is shaped by later theological interpretation rather than historical fact. Virtually all scholars agree that Jesus was executed around 30 CE. However, the earliest gospel, Mark, was not written until approximately 65 to 70 CE, about 35 to 40 years later. Matthew and Luke followed around 80 to 85 CE, and John was written last, around 90 to 95 CE. To put this in perspective, imagine writing the news article about Mike Tyson's first boxing match in 1985, but writing it today, with no written records or video footage from his career, only decades of oral tradition. What did people say about Mike Tyson's first fight? How has the story changed over the decades? Over that span of time, details would be distorted, embellished, or even invented. And it appears that this is precisely what happened with the stories about Jesus. For roughly 4 decades, Jesus' stories were passed down orally. But oral traditions do not preserve stories with photographic accuracy. Anthropologists have shown that oral cultures freely adapt stories to fit different audiences and theological needs. In the case of Jesus, his followers likely reshaped narratives to align with their evolving beliefs about his divinity and mission. Just as is the case with Mike Tyson's first fight, it's unlikely that these Gospels can provide us with any level of accuracy about specific stories, events, and especially the famous sayings and parables that Jesus told. Next, let's discuss who actually wrote the Gospels. Despite their traditional names, the Gospels were written anonymously. Nowhere in the original manuscripts do they claim to be authored by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. These names were assigned in the 2nd century, long after the books were written, to lend them apostolic credibility. There are compelling reasons to doubt these attributions. First, the Gospels are written in polished Greek, not Aramaic, which was the language spoken by Jesus and his disciples. Next, the disciples, according to Acts 4:13, were illiterate peasants. Let's look at that verse together. Acts 4:13. Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they marveled, and they took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus. So these scribes and rulers found Peter and John to be illiterate, unlearned men. The gospel authors, however, were highly literate, educated individuals familiar with Greek literary traditions. Is it impossible that these writers, Jesus' disciples and others close to them, became highly literate in the decades after Jesus' death? It's possible, but very unlikely. Lastly, all of the Gospels are written in the 3rd person, showing no sign of being first-hand accounts. It's also worth noting that even if it turned out to be true that these authors were eyewitnesses of the events of Jesus' life, they certainly were not witnesses of the events surrounding his birth, as recorded by Matthew and Luke, rather inconsistently, I might add. But again, we see no evidence that these are first-hand accounts. We never find John or Matthew saying, "I did this," or "Jesus said to me." You would think sayings like that would build credibility if they were indeed written by the authors that were later assigned. If these books were written by later Greek-speaking Christians who never met Jesus, how can they be considered reliable biographies? Now, one of the biggest issues with the Gospels is their contradictions. If they were eyewitness accounts, we would expect consistency. Instead, we find significant discrepancies. Let's look at a couple of examples. We just talked about the birth narratives, Matthew versus Luke. In Matthew, Mary and Joseph live in Bethlehem. Then the Magi visit, and the family then flees to Egypt. But in Luke, we find a different account. Mary and Joseph lived in Nazareth, and they traveled to Bethlehem for a census that's not mentioned in Matthew, and then return home after the birth. They don't go to Egypt. We also see that Matthew has Herod ordering the massacre of infants, but Luke seems to be completely unaware of this event. You would think that something like that would be such an extreme event that Luke would have mentioned it, and probably other authors, other writers of the time would mention a massacre of all the babies that Herod ordered to be killed. And we don't find that anywhere except for the book of Matthew. It's interesting. The second example we'll look at is, when did Jesus die? Now, according to Mark, Jesus was crucified the morning after the Passover meal. But in John, Jesus dies the day before the Passover, at the exact moment the Passover lambs were being slaughtered. And this change seems deliberate. You see, back in that time, the Passover feast started with the day of preparation, the day before. And this was the day that the lambs were slaughtered. And the next day was when the Passover feast was served. This is where we find Jesus having the Last Supper with his disciples. But John wanted to portray Jesus as the ultimate Passover sacrifice, even if that meant altering the timeline. So these differences suggest that at least one, if not both, of these accounts was invented to fulfill theological and prophetic purposes. The evidence suggests that the gospel writers modified earlier stories to fit their theological viewpoints. One clear example is how Jesus' words and deeds evolve from Mark to John. Now, we'll go into much more detail on this in future videos, but here's a quick example. In Mark, Jesus is more human and emotional. Before his crucifixion, he prays to God to take this cup from him, expressing fear. But in John, Jesus is fully in control. He doesn't plead for his life, but instead he boldly declares, "It is finished." These changes align with each author's theological agenda. Mark presents Jesus as a suffering servant, while John portrays him as a divine figure in command of his fate. If the Gospels were strict historical biographies, we would not expect such major shifts in characterization. Given these contradictions, theological agendas, and the long gap between Jesus' life and the writing of the Gospels, how much of what they say is historical? Most scholars agree that while some details may be rooted in history, much of the material is legendary or exaggerated. What are the historical facts? Well, scholars generally agree on just a few things. Number one, they agree that Jesus was a Jewish preacher who gained a following. They agree that he was baptized by John the Baptist, and they agree that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Beyond that, nearly everything else is debated. Did Jesus really walk on water? Did he feed thousands with a few loaves and fish? Did he rise from the dead? The evidence for these supernatural claims is based solely on texts written decades later by anonymous believers, not independent historical sources. In conclusion, the Gospels are not straightforward biographies. They are theological narratives shaped by the decades of oral tradition, religious belief, and literary creativity. They were written by anonymous Greek-speaking Christians, not by eyewitnesses, and they contain contradictions and theological embellishments, making them unreliable as objective historical accounts. This doesn't mean that they are without value. The Gospels provide insight into early Christian beliefs and how Jesus was remembered by his followers. But if we want to understand the historical Jesus, we must recognize that separating fact from fiction in these texts is difficult and sometimes an impossible task. By critically examining the Gospels, we gain a clearer understanding of how religious texts are shaped, how stories evolve over time, and how historical figures can be transformed into legendary characters. The question we must ask ourselves is not just whether the Gospels contain some truth, but how much of what they claim can actually be verified. Now that we've explored the Gospels as a whole, it's time to examine them individually. What if I told you that the earliest Gospel, Mark, presents a very different Jesus than the ones most Christians believe in? In our next video in the New Testament for Skeptics series, we'll take a deep dive into Mark and uncover why some scholars think it tells us the most about the historical Jesus, while there's others who argue it's a theological construct. We'll see you in the next video.